The silence was deafening until a 9-year-old boy shattered it without saying a word. Marcus Sterling sat alone at table 12 in Le Bernardin, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. His Armani suit, custom-tailored to perfection, couldn't hide the weight he carried in his shoulders. The $15,000 Patek Philippe watch on his wrist ticked away seconds of a life measured in billions but lived in isolation. Before him sat a plate of untouched Dover sole, the delicate fish growing cold as steam rose like whispers into the ambient lighting. To any observer, Marcus appeared to be the picture of success. At 42, he had built Sterling Tech from a garage startup into a $50 billion empire that revolutionized accessibility software. His apps helped millions of people with disabilities navigate the digital world. Yet here he sat, night after night, at the same table, eating the same meal, surrounded by the same crushing silence that had defined his existence for over 3 decades. The maitre d' approached with practiced reverence. "Mr. Sterling, your usual wine?" Marcus nodded without looking up, his fingers already reaching for the leather-bound notepad he carried everywhere. He scribbled quickly, "Thank you, Henri." The 2015 Chablis. Henri had learned years ago not to expect verbal responses. In the rarefied world of New York's elite dining scene, eccentricity was often mistaken for genius, and Marcus Sterling's silence was simply another quirk of the ultra-wealthy. But Marcus wasn't choosing silence. Silence had chosen him. At age 7, Marcus had been a chatterbox, the kind of child who asked endless questions and narrated his every action. He talked to his toys, his reflection, even the family goldfish. His parents, both successful attorneys, had often joked that their son would either become a lawyer or a radio host. Then came the accident that changed everything. The drunk driver who ran the red light never saw the Sterling family sedan. Marcus's parents died instantly. He survived, but the trauma and subsequent medical complications robbed him of something he had never truly appreciated until it was gone: his hearing. Complete. Irreversible. The world became a silent movie with no subtitles. But Marcus had never learned sign language. In the aftermath of losing everything, his grief-stricken relatives focused on what they saw as more practical solutions. Hearing aids that barely helped. Lip-reading lessons that left him frustrated and exhausted. Note-writing that kept him at arm's length from genuine human connection. His well-meaning uncle, now his guardian, believed that if Marcus worked hard enough, he could overcome his disability and rejoin the hearing world. So Marcus learned to navigate a silent universe armed only with written words and an exceptional ability to read people's faces, body language, and the micro-expressions that revealed more than voices ever could. He became a master of observation, watching the world with the intensity of someone who knew that missing a single visual cue could mean missing everything. If this story of isolation and unexpected connection is already touching your heart, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss stories like this that show the incredible power of human understanding. And tell me in the comments, have you ever felt completely alone even when surrounded by people? Let's see where Marcus's journey takes us. The restaurant hummed with the usual evening symphony of clinking glasses, muffled conversations, and the soft scrape of silverware against porcelain. Marcus saw it all but heard none of it. He had taught himself to read the rhythm of the room through vibrations in the floor, changes in lighting as servers moved between tables, and the subtle shifts in air pressure that indicated movement nearby. Tonight felt different, though. There was an energy in the air that Marcus couldn't quite identify. He looked up from his notepad to scan the dining room, his trained eyes automatically cataloging the familiar faces. The tech journalist from Forbes who always ordered the lobster. The pharmaceutical heiress who never touched her food but drank 3 martinis every Tuesday. The oil executive who spoke too loudly into his phone, unaware that his voice carried across the restaurant like a foghorn. Then Marcus saw him. A small boy, perhaps 9 years old, sat at a corner table with an elderly woman who appeared to be his grandmother. The child had rich, dark skin and wore a button-down shirt that was slightly too large for his thin frame. But it wasn't his appearance that caught Marcus's attention. It was his hands. The boy was signing. His fingers moved with fluid precision, crafting words in the air with the kind of practiced elegance that spoke of years of use. The grandmother watched his hands intently, occasionally nodding or shaking her head, but it was clear she didn't fully understand the language her grandson was speaking. She was trying, though. Marcus could see it in the way she leaned forward, in the concentration etched across her weathered features, in the love that radiated from her eyes even when communication faltered. Marcus felt something stir in his chest. A recognition so deep it felt like déjà vu. Here was another person navigating the world through gesture and expression, another soul who understood that communication transcended sound. Yet unlike Marcus, this child had embraced the visual language that Marcus had spent 35 years avoiding. The boys suddenly looked up, and their eyes met across the restaurant. For a moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, the child signed something that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. "You look sad. Are you like me?" Marcus blinked, unsure if he had read the signs correctly. It had been decades since anyone had communicated with him in ASL, and his knowledge was rudimentary at best. But the boy's expression was clear, open, curious. There was no pity in his dark eyes, no awkwardness. Just recognition. The grandmother noticed her grandson's distraction and followed his gaze to Marcus's table. Her expression immediately shifted to one of protective concern. She reached out and gently turned the boy's face back toward her, signing something that was clearly a gentle reprimand. But the child shook his head and pointed again toward Marcus. Marcus found himself frozen. In 35 years of dining alone, no one had ever approached him with genuine curiosity rather than business propositions or social climbing attempts. He watched as the boy whispered something to his grandmother, his hands still moving in animated signs. The woman looked uncertain, glancing between her grandson and the impeccably dressed billionaire across the room. The boy stood up. Marcus's heart rate accelerated as the child began walking toward his table. Every instinct told him to look away, to pretend he hadn't seen the signs, to retreat into the comfortable isolation that had protected him for so long. But something kept his eyes fixed on the approaching figure. The boy stopped just beside Marcus's table, close enough that Marcus could see the intelligence sparkling in his eyes, the slight gap between his front teeth, the small scar above his left eyebrow that spoke of childhood adventures. He was beautiful in the way that only children can be, unmarked by the cynicism and calculation that had colored every interaction in Marcus's adult life. "Hi," the boy said aloud, his voice slightly distorted in the way that indicated he had been deaf since early childhood. "I'm Jaden." Then his hands moved again. "You didn't answer my question." Marcus stared at him, his carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. He reached for his notepad, hands trembling slightly as he wrote, "I don't understand sign language very well." Jaden read the note and tilted his head, considering. Then he signed more slowly, exaggerating each gesture, "But you're deaf, right?" "I can tell." The directness of the question stunned Marcus. In his world of corporate euphemisms and careful social dancing, no one ever stated uncomfortable truths so plainly. He wrote, "Yes. But I never learned to sign properly." "Why not?" Jaden's hands asked. Marcus stared at the question for a long time. Why not? He had told himself for decades that he didn't need sign language, that written communication was more professional, more dignified. But sitting here, faced with a child's innocent directness, the real reason crystallized with painful clarity. Because learning sign language would have meant accepting his deafness. It would have meant admitting that the accident had changed him permanently, that he was part of a community he had spent his entire adult life pretending he didn't belong to. It would have meant grieving not just for his parents, but for the hearing boy he had been and would never be again. He wrote slowly, "I was afraid." Jaden read the note and nodded with the kind of wisdom that seemed far too old for his young face. "My grandma says fear makes people do silly things. Like pretending they don't need help." The grandmother had approached during their exchange, her face a mixture of mortification and protectiveness. She placed a gentle hand on Jaden's shoulder and signed something that Marcus interpreted as an apology, though her gestures were clumsy and hesitant. Marcus looked up at the woman, really looked at her, and saw exhaustion etched in every line of her face. Her clothes were clean but worn, her hands rough from physical labor. She wore the uniform of a cleaning service under her coat, and Marcus realized with a start that he had seen her before. She was one of the night janitors in his building. He wrote quickly, "Please don't apologize. He's not bothering me." The grandmother read the note and her shoulders relaxed slightly. She signed something to Jaden, who translated aloud, "Grandma Rosa says she's sorry if I'm being rude. She's still learning sign language because I've only been living with her for 2 years. Where were you before?" Marcus found himself writing. Jaden's expression grew serious. "Foster care. Different families. Most people don't want deaf kids. They think we're broken or too much work." He paused, studying Marcus's face. "But you're not broken, are you? You're just lonely." The observation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Here was a 9-year-old child who had been shuffled through the foster system, who had been labeled difficult or defective simply because he communicated differently, and yet he had somehow maintained enough empathy to see past Marcus's wealth and status to the isolation beneath. Henri approached the table, clearly uncomfortable with the unusual situation. "Mr. Sterling, is everything all right? Should I?" Marcus held up a hand and wrote rapidly, "Everything is fine. Would you please bring 2 more chairs and menus for my guests?" Henry's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline, but he recovered quickly. "Of course, sir. Right away." Rosa's eyes widened in shock. She signed something urgent to Jaden, who translated, "She says we can't afford to eat here and we don't want charity." Marcus wrote, "It's not charity. It's dinner with the first person in years who's spoken to me like a human being instead of a bank account." Rosa read the note and something shifted in her expression. The defensive wariness remained, but underneath it, Marcus caught a glimpse of understanding. She had probably spent years protecting her grandson from people who saw his deafness as either inspiration or pity. She recognized the difference between genuine connection and performative kindness. Jaden was already climbing into the chair Henri had provided, his eyes bright with excitement. He signed rapidly to his grandmother, then turned to Marcus. "I told her you seem nice but sad, and that maybe we all need friends." As Rosa settled reluctantly into her chair, Marcus found himself studying the 2 of them with new eyes. The boy's hands never stopped moving, constantly translating between the spoken English Rosa was comfortable with and the ASL that came naturally to him. He was a bridge between 2 worlds, carrying the weight of communication for both himself and his grandmother with the kind of grace that most adults never achieved. The server approached with menus, and Marcus watched Rosa's face grow tight with anxiety as she looked at the prices. He wrote quickly, "Order anything you want. I insist." "Why?" Rosa had learned enough signs to ask the basic question. Marcus paused, his pen hovering over the paper. Why indeed? He could have said it was because he was wealthy and this was nothing to him. He could have claimed it was simple kindness or corporate social responsibility. But Jaden's unflinching honesty had created a space where only truth seemed appropriate. "Because your grandson is the first person in 35 years to see me instead of my money," he wrote. "And because I think I have a lot to learn from both of you." Rosa read the note and her defenses crumbled just a little. She signed something to Jaden, who grinned and turned to Marcus. "She says you can't buy friends, but maybe you can buy dinner while people decide if they like each other." Marcus found himself smiling for the first time in months. There was something refreshingly direct about this family's approach to human connection. No games, no hidden agendas, just honest assessment and the willingness to give someone a chance. As they waited for their food, Jaden began teaching Marcus basic signs. The simple ones first: hello, thank you, please, friend. Marcus's fingers felt clumsy and uncertain, like trying to write with his non-dominant hand. But Jaden was patient, correcting his hand shapes with gentle touches and encouraging nods. "Your name is Marcus," Jaden finger-spelled slowly. "But in sign language, we usually have name signs. Special signs just for you." He demonstrated several options, each one a unique combination of handshapes and movements that could represent Marcus more efficiently than spelling out his full name. "How do you choose?" Marcus wrote. "It depends on what makes you special," Jaden explained. "Like, my sign name is this." He made a quick gesture that combined the sign 4J with a movement that suggested writing or drawing. "Because I love to write stories and draw pictures." Marcus watched the boy's hands as he explained, marveling at the elegance and efficiency of the visual language he had spent so long avoiding. Each sign was like a small work of art, conveying not just meaning but emotion, context, even personality. Rosa had been observing their interaction with growing amazement. She leaned forward and spoke directly to Marcus, her words careful and accented with the rhythms of her native Spanish. "He has never, how do you say, taken to someone so quickly. Usually, he is shy with new people." Jaden translated her words into sign, adding his own commentary. "She's worried you might be like the other rich people who promise things and then disappear." It happened before. The casual mention of disappointment in the boy's past made Marcus's chest tighten. How many well-meaning adults had failed this child? How many promises had been broken by people who saw his deafness as either inspiration or burden rather than simply part of who he was? "I don't make promises lightly," Marcus wrote. "But I promise that if you want to continue these conversations, I will be here." Jaden read the note and signed the translation to Rosa, who studied Marcus's face with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read people's intentions quickly and accurately. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her because she nodded once and signed something that made Jaden beam. "She says okay, but if you hurt my feelings, she'll tell everyone in your building that you eat alone every night like a sad penguin." Marcus burst out laughing, a sound so unexpected that several nearby diners turned to look. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had threatened him with such delightfully specific social embarrassment. It was exactly the kind of threat that could only come from someone who had nothing to lose and everything to protect. Their food arrived, and Marcus watched in fascination as Jaden and Rosa navigated their meal with the kind of wordless coordination that spoke of deep understanding. Jaden automatically cut his grandmother's meat when he saw her arthritis was bothering her hands. Rosa made sure Jaden's vegetables were distributed evenly across his plate in the way he preferred. They had created their own language of care that transcended both spoken words and formal signs. As they ate, Jaden peppered Marcus with questions about his work, his life, his building. But unlike the invasive probing Marcus was used to from business associates and social climbers, Jaden's curiosity felt genuine and uncomplicated. He wanted to know if Marcus had pets, no, what his favorite color was, blue, and whether he had ever been on a roller coaster, yes, before the accident. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Marcus wrote. "A teacher," Jaden signed without hesitation. "I want to teach hearing kids about deaf culture and deaf kids that they can do anything. Maybe I'll have a school where everyone learns both languages, speaking and signing." The casual confidence with which the boy discussed his future plans struck Marcus powerfully. Here was a child who had been rejected by multiple families, who faced daily challenges in a world designed for hearing people, and yet he dreamed not of escaping his deafness but of building bridges between communities. "That sounds like an amazing school," Marcus wrote. "I'd like to visit it someday." "You could help build it," Jaden suggested with the matter-of-fact optimism of childhood. "You have money and I have ideas. We could be partners." Rosa caught enough of the exchange to look alarmed. She signed rapidly to Jaden, clearly warning him against making presumptions about their new acquaintance's generosity. But Marcus found himself genuinely considering the boy's proposal. He had spent decades building technology to help people with disabilities, but always from a distance, always through intermediaries. What would it mean to work directly with the community he had been avoiding? As the evening wound down, Marcus felt a strange reluctance to let them leave. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a shared language, a comfortable space where understanding could grow without the need for constant chatter. Jaden was teaching him the sign for friend when a commotion at the front of the restaurant caught their attention. A man in an expensive suit was arguing loudly with Omri, his voice carrying across the dining room with the kind of entitled anger that Marcus recognized from 1,000 business meetings. "I don't care if you're fully booked," the man was saying. "Do you know who I am? I'm Richard Hartwell from Hartwell Industries. I eat here twice a week." Marcus watched Jaden's face change as he observed the scene. The boy's expression grew thoughtful, then sad. He signed something to Rosa, who looked toward the front of the restaurant and shook her head disapprovingly. "What is he saying?" Marcus wrote. "He's being loud and mean because he thinks money makes him important," Jaden signed. "But you have more money than him and you're not mean. Why is that?" The question hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Marcus stared at his notepad, struggling to find an answer that would make sense to a 9-year-old. How could he explain that wealth often amplified whatever was already inside a person? That money could make kind people kinder and cruel people crueler? That he had spent years using his fortune as a wall between himself and the world, which was perhaps just another form of cruelty? "I think money shows you who people really are," he finally wrote. "It doesn't change them." Jaden considered this with the seriousness of a philosophy student. "So you were always kind? Even before you had money?" Marcus thought back to his childhood, to the boy who had asked endless questions and narrated his every action. Had that child been kind? Or had kindness been a luxury he learned only after losing everything else? "I think I'm still learning how to be kind," he wrote honestly. "Me too," Jaden signed. "Grandma says it's harder when people are mean to you first. But she says being mean back just makes more meanness in the world." Rosa had been following their exchange through Jaden's translations, and now she reached across the table to touch Marcus's hand gently. Her fingers were rough from years of manual labor, but her touch was warm and steady. "Gracias," she said simply, then signed the word as well. Marcus looked between the grandmother and grandson, these two people who had somehow wandered into his carefully ordered life and turned it upside down in the space of a single meal. Tomorrow, he would return to his silent penthouse, his empty schedule, his meticulously controlled existence. But something fundamental had shifted tonight, and he knew there was no going back to the man who had walked into this restaurant alone. "Same time next week?" he wrote. Jaden's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Yes. And next time, I'll teach you the signs for all the foods. And maybe some curse words, but don't tell Grandma." Rosa had understood enough to swat playfully at her grandson's shoulder, which only made him grin wider. As they prepared to leave, Marcus found himself standing as well, an old-fashioned courtesy that felt important somehow. He handed Rosa a business card and wrote on the back, "My personal number. If you or Jaden ever need anything." Rosa studied the card, and Marcus saw her eyes widen as she read his full name and title. She looked up at him with new understanding, perhaps realizing for the first time exactly how wealthy her grandson's new friend really was. But instead of the grasping eagerness Marcus expected, he saw only concern. She signed something urgent to Jaden, who translated reluctantly, "She wants to know if you're going to try to adopt me or something. Rich people sometimes do that, and she says she won't let anyone take me away from her." The protective fierceness in Rosa's voice was unmistakable, and Marcus felt a surge of respect for this woman who would stand against billionaires to protect her grandchild. He wrote carefully, "I don't want to take him away. I just want to be his friend. Is that okay?" Rosa read the note and studied Marcus's face for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly and signed something that made Jaden grin. "She says okay, but if you break my heart, she'll break your legs." Marcus laughed again, that surprising sound that seemed to come more easily in their presence. "Tell her I understand. And that I think Jaden is lucky to have someone who loves him that much." As they walked toward the exit, Jaden suddenly stopped and turned back. He ran to Marcus and, without warning, wrapped his small arms around the man's waist in a fierce hug. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the unexpected contact. It had been years since anyone had touched him with such unself-conscious affection. Slowly, carefully, Marcus returned the embrace, his hands resting gently on the boy's shoulders. Through the child's thin shirt, he could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the warm proof of life and hope and possibility that Marcus had forgotten could exist. When Jaden finally pulled away, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. He signed something too quickly for Marcus to follow, then ran back to Rosa without waiting for a response. "What did he say?" Marcus called out. Rosa turned back, her own eyes damp. "He said, 'Thank you for seeing me.'" And then they were gone, leaving Marcus standing alone in the restaurant with the weight of those words settling into his chest like stones in still water. Henri approached hesitantly, clearly uncertain about the evening's unusual events. "Shall I reserve your usual table for next week, Mr. Sterling?" Marcus looked at the table where he had sat alone for so many years, then at the empty chairs where Jaden and Rosa had brought such unexpected light into his carefully controlled darkness. "No," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. "Reserve a table for 3. Henry's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he nodded professionally. "Of course, sir. Table for 3. As Marcus walked out into the cool Manhattan evening, he found his mind racing with possibilities he had never allowed himself to consider. For 35 years, he had lived in a world of his own making, safe but sterile, successful but empty. Tonight, a 9-year-old boy had cracked that world open with nothing more than honest curiosity and unconditional acceptance. The city streets buzzed with their usual nighttime energy, but Marcus barely noticed. His hands moved almost involuntarily, practicing the signs Jaden had taught him. "Hello. Thank you. Friend." Such simple words, but in the language of hands and hearts, they felt like the beginning of something profound. Back in his penthouse, Marcus stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The city spread out before him like a glittering circuit board, millions of lights representing millions of lives he had never truly considered. For the first time in decades, he felt connected to something larger than his own carefully constructed isolation. He pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app, then paused. Instead of typing, he set the phone aside and picked up a pen and paper. His handwriting was precise, controlled, the product of years of relying on written communication. But tonight, he found himself writing with a different kind of purpose. "Day 1 of learning to be human again," he wrote. "Met Jaden and Rosa. Remember, there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. I've been lonely for 35 years. Maybe it's time to stop." He folded the paper and placed it in his desk drawer, next to contracts worth millions of dollars and business plans that would shape the future of technology. But somehow, this simple note felt more important than any of them. Tomorrow, he would begin learning American Sign Language properly. Not the scattered words he had picked up tonight, but the full, rich language that Jaden moved through like poetry. He would hire the best teachers, buy the best materials, dedicate himself to this new skill with the same intensity he had once brought to building his empire. But more than that, he would learn how to build bridges instead of walls. How to see people instead of problems. How to be the kind of friend that a wise, brave, 9-year-old boy deserved. For the first time in decades, Marcus Sterling fell asleep with a smile on his face and hope in his heart. And in a small apartment across the city, Jaden was telling his grandmother about the sad man who wasn't really sad anymore, whose silence was finally ready to sing. 3 months into their weekly dinners, Marcus Sterling had become a different man. His penthouse, once a sterile monument to solitary success, now featured ASL dictionaries scattered across coffee tables, practice videos bookmarked on every device, and sticky notes with sign language reminders plastered on mirrors and refrigerators. He had hired Dr. Sarachin, one of the country's most respected ASL instructors, for daily lessons, but it was Jaden who remained his most patient and effective teacher. The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed in Marcus's professional life. His assistant, Margaret, had worked for him for 8 years and had never heard him speak more than the occasional thank you or yes. Now she found herself learning basic signs to better communicate with her boss, who seemed more engaged and present than she had ever seen him. "Your 3 o'clock is here," Margaret signed carefully, her movements still hesitant but improving. "Thank you," Marcus signed back, then added aloud, "Please send them in." Margaret's eyes widened slightly. Even after months of gradual change, she still seemed surprised when Marcus used his voice. The sound was rusty from decades of disuse, but it was there, growing stronger with each passing week. The meeting was with the board of the Sterling Foundation, the charitable arm of his company that had operated largely without his direct involvement for years. Today, however, Marcus had a proposal that required his personal attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carefully measured, "I want to discuss expanding our accessibility initiatives to include a comprehensive deaf education program." Board member Patricia Wainwright, a sharp-featured woman in her 60s who had been questioning Marcus's recent behavioral changes, leaned forward. "Marcus, while we appreciate your renewed interest in hands-on philanthropy, our current programs are already fully funded. Adding new initiatives would require significant budget reallocation." Marcus had anticipated this resistance. He pulled up a presentation he had spent weeks preparing, each slide crafted with the precision of a man who understood that changing minds required more than passion, it required irrefutable logic. "Our current accessibility programs reach 2.3 million users globally," Marcus said, his signs now accompanying his words out of habit. "But we're missing an entire community. There are over 70 million deaf individuals worldwide, many of whom lack access to quality education and technology resources." He clicked to the next slide, which showed statistics that made several board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Educational outcomes for deaf children lagged significantly behind their hearing peers, not due to cognitive limitations, but due to systemic barriers and lack of proper resources. "I'm proposing the creation of Sterling Bridges, a program that would establish ASL integrated learning centers in underserved communities, provide technology training for deaf students, and create pathways for deaf individuals into STEM careers." Board member Robert Chin raised his hand. The financial commitment would be substantial. "What's driving this particular focus?" Marcus paused, considering how much of his personal journey to share. "I've recently reconnected with the deaf community after years of isolation. I've learned that our technology can do more than help people adapt to a hearing world. It can help create a world where different forms of communication are equally valued." Patricia's expression remained skeptical. "This sounds like a very personal project, Marcus. Are we making business decisions based on emotion?" The question hung in the air, and Marcus felt the familiar urge to retreat, to hide behind the safe walls of pure business logic. But then he thought of Jaden's unwavering honesty, of Rosa's protective fierce love, of the way both of them had refused to accept his isolation as inevitable. "Yes," Marcus said simply. "It is personal. And that's exactly why it will work." He clicked to a new slide showing preliminary partnership agreements with schools, community centers, and deaf advocacy organizations. "I've spent the last 2 months meeting with deaf community leaders, educators, and families. They don't want charity. They want partnership. They want their expertise valued and their voices heard. Sterling Bridges isn't about doing something for the deaf community, it's about doing something with them." Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the board's education specialist, looked intrigued. "What kind of community response have you received?" Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "Overwhelming enthusiasm. We have preliminary agreements with 15 organizations ready to pilot the program. The initial community investment would be $50 million over 3 years, with the potential for global expansion based on outcomes." The room fell silent as board members processed the scope of Marcus's proposal. Finally, Patricia spoke. $50 million is a significant commitment. How do we measure success? Educational outcomes, employment placement rates, community feedback, and technological innovation metrics, Marcus replied. But also by how many young people like Jaden Williams get the opportunity to reach their full potential. Robert leaned back in his chair. "This Jaden, is he the boy you've been mentoring?" Mentoring wasn't quite the right word for what had developed between Marcus and Jaden, but it was close enough for board meeting purposes. "Yes. He's 9 years old, brilliant, and dreams of becoming a teacher. In the current system, his path to that goal is unnecessarily difficult. Sterling Bridges would change that. The vote was closer than Marcus had hoped, 7 in favor, 5 against, but it passed. As the board members filed out, Patricia lingered behind. "Marcus, I have to ask, what's really driving this change in you? 8 years I've known you, and you've never shown this level of personal investment in anything." Marcus considered the question, then signed his response as he spoke. "I spent 35 years building walls around myself. I told myself it was protection, but it was really just fear. A 9-year-old boy taught me that the strongest thing you can do is let people see who you really are." Patricia watched his hands move with growing amazement. "How long have you been learning sign language?" 3 months intensively, but I should have started 35 years ago." That evening, Marcus arrived at Le Bernardin to find Jaden practically vibrating with excitement. The boy had been accepted into an advanced academic program at a school known for its inclusive approach to deaf education. Rosa beamed with pride as she watched her grandson animated hands describe his new teachers, his new classmates, and the exciting projects he would be working on. "Tell Marcus about your writing," Rosa signed. Her ASL had improved dramatically over the past months, though she still sometimes reverted to Spanish when excited. Jaden pulled out a worn notebook and flipped to a story he had been working on. It's about a king who rules a kingdom where everyone communicates differently. Some people speak, some sign, some use pictures, some use music. But they all understand each other because they listen with their hearts instead of just their ears. Marcus read the story, his throat tightening with emotion. The writing was sophisticated beyond Jaden's years, filled with metaphors and insights that would have impressed college-level creative writing students. "This is extraordinary," Marcus signed. "Have you shown this to your teachers?" "Not yet," Jaden admitted. "I'm scared they'll think it's weird." "Weird how?" "Most kids write about superheroes or sports. I write about feelings and differences and making the world better." Marcus set down the notebook and looked directly into Jaden's eyes. "The world doesn't need more stories about superheroes. It needs more stories about real heroes, people who use their differences to make others feel less alone." Rosa had been following their conversation, and now she reached across the table to squeeze Marcus's hand. In the months since their first meeting, she had become something like family to him, protective, caring, but never hesitant to call him out when his old patterns of isolation tried to resurface. "You should publish his stories," she signed. Marcus blinked in surprise. "Publish them? You have connections. Influence. Why not use it for something good?" The idea had never occurred to Marcus, but as he thought about it, the possibilities began to multiply. Jaden's stories could be the beginning of something much larger, a platform for young deaf voices, a way to change narratives about disability indifference. "Would you be interested in that?" Marcus asked Jaden. The boy's eyes went wide. "You think people would want to read my stories?" "I think people need to read your stories." As they discussed the possibilities, Marcus found himself thinking about legacy in ways he never had before. His company would outlive him, his technological innovations would benefit millions, but what Jaden was creating had the potential to change hearts and minds in ways that code and algorithms never could. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the front of the restaurant. A man was arguing loudly with the maitre d', his voice carrying across the dining room with increasing aggression. "I don't care what your reservation system says. I'm a regular customer, and I expect to be seated immediately." Marcus looked toward the disturbance and felt his blood pressure rise. The man was tall, impeccably dressed, and radiating the kind of entitled anger that Marcus had become all too familiar with in his business dealings. But it was Jaden's reaction that concerned him most. The boy had gone rigid in his chair, his usual animated expression replaced by something closer to fear. He signed something rapidly to Rosa, who immediately moved her chair closer to his. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked. "That man," Jaden signed, his hands trembling slightly. "He was at my school last week. He was asking questions about me." Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. "What kind of questions?" "About my family. About my grandmother. About why I was getting special tutoring. Jaden's signs were becoming more agitated. The principal said he was from a magazine, but something felt wrong. Rosa's face had gone pale. She signed something urgent to Jaden, then turned to Marcus. We should leave. Wait, Marcus signed. Let me handle this. He stood up and walked toward the front of the restaurant, his movement smooth but purposeful. Years of high-stakes business negotiations had taught him how to project authority without obvious aggression. Excuse me, Marcus said, approaching the man from behind. The stranger turned, and Marcus got his first clear look at him. Mid-40s, expensive suit, the kind of carefully groomed appearance that suggested he was used to getting his way through a combination of money and intimidation. I'm sorry, do I know you? The man asked, his tone dismissive. Marcus Sterling, Marcus replied, extending his hand. I couldn't help but notice you seemed frustrated. Perhaps I can help. The man's demeanor shifted instantly when he heard the name. Sterling Tech was one of the most valuable companies in the world, and Marcus's face had been on enough magazine covers that most people in their socioeconomic circle recognized him. Mr. Sterling. What a pleasant surprise. I'm David Hutchinson from Metropolitan Media Group. I'm actually working on a story that might interest you. Marcus kept his expression neutral. Oh? What kind of story? A feel-good piece about successful individuals who make time for charity work. I understand you've been spending time with some local families, mentoring disadvantaged children. The words were carefully chosen, but Marcus heard the underlying threat. This wasn't a journalist interested in positive coverage, this was someone fishing for a story that could be spun negatively. I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding, Marcus said calmly. I don't discuss my personal relationships with the media. Hutchinson's smile became predatory. Of course, of course. Privacy is important. Though I have to say, it's interesting how a man who's lived as a virtual hermit for decades suddenly develops such a close relationship with a deaf child and his grandmother. People might wonder about the nature of that relationship. Marcus felt his jaw clench, but his voice remained steady. What exactly are you implying? Oh, nothing specific. But you know how these stories go. Wealthy man, vulnerable child, no other family around to provide oversight. The optics alone could be challenging. The threat was clear now, and Marcus realized he was dealing with something far more dangerous than an overzealous journalist. This was character assassination in its most calculating form. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Marcus said, pulling out his phone. Let me introduce you to my security team. I'm sure they'd be very interested in discussing your research methods. Hutchinson's confidence wavered slightly. Now, no need for dramatics. I'm simply doing my job. Marcus confronted Hutchinson, accusing him of harassing kids and calling illegal. Within minutes, Hutchinson was escorted out, stripped of credentials, and served a cease and desist. Jaden and Rosa, still shaken, asked if others might target them. Marcus promised protection, though he feared he couldn't guarantee it. That night, he met with security and PR. Security suggested bodyguards, but Marcus refused. He didn't want Jaden living like a prisoner. PR proposed going public with the friendship to control the narrative, but Marcus rejected exploiting Jaden as a PR tool. Over the next week, Marcus agonized over the decision. He had promised Jaden and Rosa that he would protect them, but was exposure the best protection? Or would it simply invite more scrutiny and potentially more danger? The decision was taken out of his hands when a photographer captured them leaving the restaurant together. The photo, Marcus walking between Jaden and Rosa, all three of them signing animatedly, appeared on the front page of a tabloid with the headline, Tech Billionaire's Secret Family? Marcus stared at the newspaper in his office, feeling sick. The article was exactly what he had feared, full of speculation and innuendo, suggesting everything from secret adoption to inappropriate relationships. Worse, it included photos of Rosa's apartment building and Jaden's school. Margaret knocked on his door. Mr. Sterling? There are reporters outside the building. And Jaden's grandmother called, there are people at their apartment too. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. In trying to protect his new family, he had exposed them to exactly the kind of scrutiny he had spent decades avoiding. I need to fix this, he thought. I need to fix this now. 2 hours later, Marcus Sterling held his first press conference in over a decade. He stood at a podium in the lobby of Sterling Tech, his hands moving in sign language as he spoke, interpreting his own words for the deaf community that had taught him so much. 3 months ago, I met a 9-year-old boy named Jaden Williams who changed my life, Marcus began, his voice steady despite the chaos of camera flashes and shouted questions. Jaden is deaf, brilliant, and braver than any adult I know. He's also my friend. He paused, looking directly into the cameras. I'm here today because certain media outlets have chosen to sensationalize this friendship in ways that are harmful to a child and his family. I want to set the record straight. Marcus explained his own hearing loss, his decades of isolation, and how meeting Jaden had inspired both his personal growth and his professional expansion into deaf education initiatives. Jaden didn't teach me sign language to help me, Marcus continued. He taught me because he saw that I was lonely, and loneliness is something he understands. The deaf community has welcomed me not because of my wealth, but because they recognize a fellow traveler. A reporter shouted a question about the nature of his relationship with Rosa and whether there were romantic implications. Marcus's expression hardened. Rosa Williams is a grandmother who works multiple jobs to provide for her grandson. She's one of the strongest, most principled people I've ever met. Any suggestion that our relationship is anything other than friendship and mutual respect is not only wrong, it's insulting to a woman who deserves your admiration, not your suspicion. He took a breath and continued. I'm announcing today the creation of Sterling Bridges, a $50 million initiative to improve educational and technological opportunities for deaf children. Jaden Williams didn't inspire this program because he's inspirational, he inspired it because he's brilliant, and brilliance should never be wasted due to systemic barriers. The press conference continued for another 20 minutes, with Marcus fielding questions about the foundation, his personal journey, and his commitment to the deaf community. Throughout it all, his hands never stopped moving, a visual reminder that this wasn't just about charity, it was about communication, understanding, and the power of seeing people as they truly are. When it was over, Marcus felt exhausted but lighter somehow. The secret was out, for better or worse. Now they would have to live with the consequences. That evening, he arrived at Le Bernardin to find Jaden and Rosa waiting for him with expressions of concern and love that nearly broke his heart. Are you okay? Jaden signed immediately. I should be asking you that, Marcus replied. I'm sorry this happened. I tried to protect you, but I made it worse. Rosa reached across the table and took his hands, her calloused fingers gentle but firm. You did protect us, she signed. You told the truth. That's the best protection. But now everyone knows about you. About us. Jaden grinned suddenly. Good. Now I can tell people at school that my friend is famous. Despite everything, Marcus laughed. Is that what I am? Your famous friend? You're my friend who happens to be famous, Jaden corrected. There's a difference. Over the following weeks, the media attention gradually died down, but the impact of Marcus's public revelation continued to ripple outward. Sterling Bridges received thousands of applications from families, educators, and organizations wanting to participate. More importantly, it sparked conversations about deaf culture, accessibility, and the difference between inspiration and exploitation. Jaden's notebook of stories was picked up by a children's publisher who specialized in diverse voices. The book would be published in both English and ASL, with video components showing Jaden telling his stories in sign language. All proceeds would go to deaf literacy programs. But perhaps the most significant change was in Marcus himself. The man who had spent 35 years hiding behind walls of silence and wealth now found himself becoming an advocate, a bridge builder, a voice for those who had been overlooked. 6 months after that first dinner, Marcus stood in the auditorium of the First Sterling Bridges Learning Center, watching as Jaden read one of his stories to a group of deaf and hearing children. The boy's hands moved with confident grace, painting pictures in the air that transcended the boundaries of spoken language. Once upon a time, Jaden signed, there was a king who lived in a castle made of silence. He thought the silence kept him safe, but really, it just kept him lonely. Until one day, a young knight came to the castle and taught the king that the strongest walls are the ones that let light in. Rosa stood beside Marcus, tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched her grandson command the attention of his audience with nothing but his hands and his heart. "He's going to change the world," she signed. "He already has," Marcus replied, thinking of the empty restaurant table where he used to sit alone, the silent penthouse that now echoed with laughter, the foundation that was already making a difference in dozens of communities. As Jaden finished his story and the children erupted in applause, both voiced and signed, Marcus realized that the boy had been right from the very beginning. They were partners, each bringing something unique to their shared mission of building bridges between worlds that had been kept apart for too long. The story ended, but the conversation was just beginning. And for the first time in his life, Marcus Sterling was ready to listen, not just with his eyes, but with his heart. If Marcus and Jaden's friendship has inspired you to think differently about communication, connection, and the bridges we can build between different communities, please subscribe to this channel for more stories that celebrate the power of human understanding. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that our differences can be our greatest strengths. And tell me in the comments about a time when someone unexpected taught you something important about yourself. Remember, we all have the choice to be like Marcus, building walls of isolation, or like Jaden, extending hands of friendship. The world needs more bridge builders, more truth tellers, more people willing to see beyond the surface to the heart underneath. Until next time, keep listening with your heart, and never underestimate the power of a single conversation to change everything. The end.